Yeah, that's why I want to look up brand structures. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Let's Talk. Today we're going to be talking all about the brain and the structure and function and all that kind of brainy stuff. So first off, we're going to talk about neurons. The neurons are the specialized cells inside of your brain that allow your brain to function the way it does. Neurons are unique compared to other cells inside your body in that they have specialized shape and structure to allow them to do what they do. Specifically, the cell body has thin structures known as dendrites, and extending from another point on the cell, there is a singular axon extending from the main cell body down, which can extend up to a meter. The axon ends in similar thin structures to dendrites. The ends of the axons of one nerve cell meet up with the dendrites of another nerve cell. They don't contact directly, but the space in between them is where neurotransmitters are present in what's known as the synapse. These are adrenaline, noradrenaline, dopamine, serotonin, gamma-aminobutyric acid, acetylcholine, glutamate, and endorphins. Each one has a specific function or a specific chemical message that it sends. We'll go into more depth, starting with adrenaline. So I've got some notes here just so I don't screw this up. Not that I'm not all-knowing. Okay, so adrenaline is the one that most people are going to be familiar with. It's part of your fight-or-flight response. It gives you a boost in stressful situations. Noradrenaline is also active in the fight-or-flight response in contracting blood vessels to increase blood flow. It also affects attention and the responding actions in the brain. Dopamine is another one that most people are probably going to be familiar with. It is responsible for for positive feelings, motivation. Also, it is responsible for feelings of addiction. That positive boost that you get from certain drugs, whether they're legal or prescription or over the counter, that is, part and parcel of the dopamine neurotransmitter. Serotonin, as I'm sure some people are familiar with, it contributes to a feeling of well-being and happiness and helps sleep cycles and digestive system regulation. It is also affected by not only exercise, but light exposure, which I find pretty interesting. The more rapid reuptake of the serotonin is part of depression and anxiety disorders, which is why SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, actually stop your nerve cells from taking up serotonin as quickly, so it stays in the synapse longer and gives you the benefits that it does. The next one, GABA, or GABA, is gamma-aminobutyric acid. And this is one that I had heard of, but I had no idea what it actually did. Apparently, it calms firing nerves in the central nervous system. High levels of GABA help to improve focus, while low levels cause anxiety. It also contributes to motor control and vision. I had no idea about that one. Acetylcholine helps to improve concentration and memory, as does glutamate. They're both very useful in learning and controlling memory. And last one is probably the one that people are the most familiar with aside from adrenaline, and that is endorphins. Endorphins are the feel-good chemical in your brain. Along with dopamine, they function in your brain's reward system. So when you do something positive, you have those good feelings, you have endorphin in your synapses. So those are the major neurotransmitters, or actually those are the only neurotransmitters that I could find. If I missed one, please let me know down below. So now we're going to move on to structures in the brain. Now that we know, how the brain is formed, with neurons releasing various neurotransmitters or chemical messengers into the synapses between the ends of the axons of one nerve and the beginning of the dendrites of another. As I mentioned before when talking about gamma-aminobutyric acid, your body has a central nervous system. The central nervous system is your brain, brainstem, and the nerves down your spinal cord, whereas your peripheral nervous system are the nerves that extend down to your fingertips and toes and other internal organs. The way that I think of it, because I'm very familiar with computers, is that the central nervous system is like the tower of a computer. You know, it's responsible for all the memory, all the processing, sending signals to and from the peripheral nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system is responsible for the inputs. So just like you would move a mouse to create, which would send a signal to the tower, which would then process that signal and send it back to the monitor, you can see an analogous system in place when it comes to basically any sensory input. I mean, for example, sitting here right now, I'm wearing a t-shirt and I'm a little bit chilly. So at the moment, my body is not going to be, or my central nervous system is not going to be sending messages to my sweat glands to produce sweat because I'm already cold. If I were colder, my central nervous system would be sending signals to my muscles to contract and shiver. And I mean, that's just a very basic example. I mean, even right now, sitting in front of your computer screen, there's light emitting from the screen going into your eyes, that your eyes are receiving that signal, sending it to your central nervous system to process, and then you're gaining information and understanding from the signals that your eyes are receiving. And at this very moment, I'm sure some of you are also sending signals back to your hand, clicking that little back arrow so you can stop listening to me talk. Or, you know, maybe hopefully clicking that little thumbs up button down below. But, you know, you don't have to. So while the central nervous system, including the brainstem and the spinal cord, are all very interesting, and so is the peripheral nervous system, the main powerhouse of your nervous system is, of course, the brain. So we're going to touch on a few areas of the brain. Okay, so let's start with the general overview of the brain. As I'm sure you know, there are two main components to the brain. You have your cerebrum, which is the largest part of the brain, and you have the cerebellum. Now, the cerebrum is, when looking at a picture of a brain or thinking about, you know, the iconic shape of a brain, that's what you're thinking of. It's the cerebrum. First, you have the frontal lobe, obviously located at the front. You have you have the frontal lobe, but it's located way back here. No, sorry, that's a stupid joke. So you have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. Now, of course, that's not exactly where they're going to be in your brain, but that's an approximation of where they would be. And each one of these lobes has structures in it, specializing it for particular functions. The frontal lobe is associated with reasoning, planning, parts of speech, movement, emotions, and problem solving. The parietal lobe is associated with movement, orientation, recognition, and perception of stimuli. The occipital lobe is associated with visual processing, and the temporal lobe is associated with perception and recognition of auditory stimuli, memory, and speech. And yes, I did just read all of that off of this website. Sorry, I couldn't remember all that. That's a lot of stuff to keep in mind. And now you also have, as I mentioned, the cerebellum. The cerebellum is the smaller section at the base of your brain, also sometimes referred to as your reptilian brain or hindbrain. It's responsible for more basic things like coordination and movement. Also, with posture and balance. Totally didn't read that. Now, the cerebellum is thought to be an older structure in that in an evolutionary sense. That is, that animals thought to have evolved before humans do have a developed cerebellum, but don't necessarily have the presence of a cerebrum. So now there's also the limbic system. It refers to 4 structures in the brain. I believe, structurally speaking, it's kind of centralized. So you'd have the 2 hemispheres, And then, like, right in the middle on the bottom there, you'd have this limbic system. Now, I'm not 100% sure on that, but I'm pretty sure that's where it is. And the limbic system has your thalamus, hypothalamus, amygdala, and hippocampus. And if those sound familiar, well, they have been, especially the amygdala, in reference in popular culture because they control emotion. And lastly, we have the brainstem. Now, the brainstem, as I'm sure you can imagine, goes down to the spinal column. The brainstem is responsible for, like, basic, like, that's the bit that keeps you alive. Like, it's the thing that regulates your heartbeat and your breathing and your autonomic nervous system. It contains the midbrain, pons, and medulla. So I'm just gonna touch on a few things. Mentioned the various lobes of the cerebrum. I'm not going to go too in depth in that. There's a ton of research that's been done into brains and stuff. So there is just an overwhelming wealth of information that you can look into. So it would be difficult for me to narrow down exactly what to talk about vis-a-vis the cerebrum. But also the cerebellum is, as I mentioned, responsible for some more base things: coordination, movement, posture, and balance. And so while that is interesting, I'm also not going to touch on that any further because that kind of sums it up. So I'm just want to talk about the amygdala and the medulla a little bit more. Okay, fine. We'll talk about the hippocampus and the thalamus and hypothalamus as well. All right, let's start with the thalamus, actually. So, the thalamus, and again, I'm just gonna read this because I don't want to try and remember it and just screw it all up and give you guys wrong information. So the thalamus is a large mass of gray matter deeply situated in the forebrain. The thalamus is basically like the gateway to the rest of your cerebrum for all of your sensory input, except for olfaction, apparently. If you don't know what that means, olfaction, or the olfactory sense, is your sense of smell. So these sensory inputs get routed through the thalamus and then sent to the part of your cerebrum that is responsible for processing those inputs. So the hypothalamus is involved in homeostasis, emotion, thirst, hunger, circadian rhythms, and control of the autonomic nervous system. It also controls the pituitary gland. See, yeah, I didn't know any of that. So, just to define some of these terms here, homeostasis is your body's way of regulating its own internal state. So, making sure that your blood is the right pH, making sure that your skin is the right temperature, and that your internal organs are the right temperature. Emotion, thirst, hunger, those are all pretty basic terms. Circadian rhythms refer to your sleep-wake cycle. So, like when you're wide awake or when you're tired or when you're asleep. So, sometimes you'll hear people say, oh, my sleep cycle's all messed up. They're actually referring to the circadian rhythms, which can be messed up if you're sleeping at inappropriate vis-a-vis your schedule, not just, I don't mean like sleeping at a funeral. I mean like sleeping at 2 o'clock in the afternoon as opposed to just sleeping at night. That's what I mean by inappropriate times. It also controls the autonomic nervous system, which I didn't know. I had assumed that was the brainstem. So I might go back and edit that out. But if I do, I'll edit this part out too, so that makes more sense. But I might not. I might just leave it all in there. And apparently it controls the pituitary gland, which, as you might guess, plays a big factor in puberty. Next, we have the amygdala, which is, kind of the major emotion center. Let's see here. Located in the temporal lobe. Yeah. Okay, so it's involved in memory, emotion, and fear. I don't know exactly why they separated emotion from fear, since fear is an emotion, but, whatever. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. Yeah, it's involved in those three major areas. It's generally referred to as the part of the brain that is responsible for controlling emotions. which is why it's referenced in pop culture a lot. So next we have the hippocampus, which is a place where hippos go to university. That is so lame. The hippocampus is involved in learning and memory, for converting short-term memory to more permanent memory, and for recalling spatial relationships in the world around us. The medulla, part of the brainstem, the four previous things, of course, as I mentioned before, are part of the limbic system. The brainstem is made up of the pons, midbrain, and the medulla, or the medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata seems to be the last bit of the brainstem connecting your brain to the spinal cord. And as I mentioned before, the medulla is responsible for the most vital functions in your body, specifically regulating your breathing and your heart rate. That's all the stuff in the brain and neurons and neurotransmitters and all that brain stuff. And so you might be wondering, well, if there's something in your brain, the medulla oblongata, that controls your breathing, how come you can manually control your breathing? Well, you have control over the musculature in your body to an extent, of course. And so you can control your diaphragm and the intercostal muscles of your rib cage to expand and contract at will. And I know that some people, just when talking about breathing, will start consciously thinking about it, and then it takes them a while or a concerted effort to switch back to letting the body regulate the breathing on its own, which is really interesting. I think this is probably a byproduct of evolving the cerebrum. The cerebrum overall is involved in higher functioning and like further processing of input from your limbic system, brainstem, and cerebellum. As I mentioned before, it's interesting that not all animals have a cerebrum. As I mentioned before, the cerebellum is referred to sometimes as the reptilian brain because reptiles don't have a neocortex. My understanding of your ability to control your breathing is that it's a byproduct of the evolution of the cerebrum. And we also know that through certain practices, we can, to a degree, control our heart rate as well. Just meditate as a form of relaxation, who do it often, they might be able to regulate their heart rate to a degree as well. You also see this in some stage performers, especially when it comes to like holding your breath for a long time, or certain underwater escape artists, stuff like that. They would need to control their heart rate so that they don't use up their oxygen supply as quickly, and they give themselves more time to do what it is that they're trying to do. It is thought by some non-scientific people that our brain has capabilities yet to be understood scientifically. Whether or not I believe in that is kind of irrelevant, but I will say that I haven't seen any solid evidence for it. There are people out there who claim to be able to contact the dead, or who claim to have psychic abilities to predict the future or find things or stuff like that. Or even to a degree, people who claim to have telekinesis or telepathy, which are defined differently, but I mean they're basically nonsense terms that don't apply to real life, so I'm not gonna bother explaining the difference there. And yeah, I mean, it would be really, really interesting to believe that we lived in that kind of a world, but again, I just haven't seen any evidence for it. If at some point human beings do evolve some sort of ability to do that, whether or not that is possible or likely is something that I don't know. I mean, if you think about some basic laws of electromagnetism, you'll see that basically anywhere that there's an electric current, there's also a magnetic field. And we know that there are chemical signals in the brain, but the neurons themselves can send electrical signals as well. So if we have these electrical signals going through our bodies, then it stands to reason that we also have a magnetic field individual to us, which has been shown with things like an EEG or an electroencephalogram, which measures the variations in these magnetic fields to help to determine what's happening in someone's brain. And I also think that the electrocardiogram, an EKG or ECG, is based somewhat on magnetic fields as well. So I mean, it's clear that human beings do have a magnetic field. It's not strong enough at present to influence anything. We need incredibly sensitive instruments in order to get any sort of information from our personal magnetic field. We have the ability to regulate our breathing to a degree. Obviously, we need to breathe in at some point and then exhale at some point as well. And we have the ability to a very slight degree, control our heart rate in terms of lowering it or raising it, not stopping it completely. So it's not impossible to think that we may, at some point in the future, develop the ability to control our own magnetic fields. Whether or not that's likely or even feasible is, again, it's something that I'm not sure of, but I don't see, from my limited perspective and my limited knowledge, why that would necessarily be impossible. It might not be practical, and it might not be something that ever actually happens, unless there is a distinct evolutionary advantage for it, or genetic modification becomes much more refined. Again, at present, I don't think it's possible, but I don't see that it would be impossible in the future to have something that would be akin to telepathy, or even necessarily telekinetics. I mean, if you are able to create a powerful enough magnetic field, you can pretty much move anything. But that is where I'm going to leave it off, because I'm starting to ramble now, and I'm probably going to cut a lot of that out. But yeah, I hope that you enjoyed this discussion, that you learned a thing or two. If you would like to see the conclusion to Humans Under a Microscope, Part 4, where we're talking about prions and viruses, which I know it's not really humans under a microscope at that point, but it's things that affect humans. I might also talk about other things that can kill us, like poisons and what else? Not like guns and knives and stuff, but I mean like microscopic. Well, are poisons microscopic? The chemicals are. Anyway, so things like that, like deadly bacteria, like flesh-eating disease, or super, or like kind of scary viruses like the dengue virus, or things like prions like mad cow disease, or poisons like deadly neurotoxin. if you played Portal, you'll get that. Stuff like that. So yeah. So if you'd like to see the conclusion to that or any of our future videos, please feel free to press the subscribe button down below, rather. If you like this particular video, please feel free to press the like button. And if there's anything that I missed, if you something that I got completely wrong, or any just opinions that you want to share, or topics you want to request that I talk about in the future, please feel free to leave a comment down below on Facebook or on Twitter. And I think that's everything that I normally say. Let's see, like, comment, subscribe. Yeah, that's everything. So until next time, have a great day.